Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
I get asked generalized legal questions from time to time. Someone asks me, Steve, non-compete agreements, are they legal? Are non-compete agreements legal? And that is, you've signed a document, a contract with somebody saying, I won't compete against you for some period of time in some place. And later on, you have second thoughts. Is that agreement enforceable? Can you break it? So here's what I'm going to tell you, that 50 states in America will have slightly different variations of this, but in most states, the logic, the rationale will follow the same thought process that I'm going to explain to you right now. So follow along. So keep in mind, state by state, what I'm telling you is not legal advice in your state. It's not legal advice in any state. I'm simply giving you the guidelines and the thought process. If this actually affects you, contact a local attorney, see how it is in your area. But generally speaking, non-compete agreements are enforceable so long as they're reasonable. And what defines how reasonable they are is dependent on a couple things, which varies based on the first obvious distinction, and that is, why were you asked to sign a non-compete? There's two primary places where you'll be asked to sign a non-compete. The first one is where you sell a business. I have the biggest plumbing business in town, and someone comes along and says, Steve, I'm going to buy your plumbing business. I'm going to pay you some money, go away, go sit on the beach someplace, and I'll take over your plumbing business. And I say, great. And they say, as part of that deal, I want you to sign an agreement saying you will not compete against me for 10 years. Because otherwise, I could sell him the plumbing business, open up again and say, hey, I'm back in business, people, and steal all the business from the business I just sold. So a state is going to look at that and go, you know something, if we don't enforce these agreements, that means that people are going to have a hard time selling your businesses. Because when people sell their businesses, they often say, as part of that, I won't compete against you. It helps you sell your business. So if it's a non-compete that you've signed as part of the sale of a business, a court's going to look at that and say, you know something, you got money for that. It helped you sell your business. We're going to enforce that. And I actually know somebody who sold a business that had a 7-year non-compete. He sold his business, and over the next 7 years, he watched the people who bought his business run it into the ground. 7 years and a day later, he started his business to compete with his old business, and promptly, boom, became huge. Other business pretty much gone, okay? But he waited out the non-compete, and he had to. So the idea is that it helps you sell your business, you get money for it, but also the two parties are presumed to be sophisticated in an arm's length transaction, meaning that you bargained with that. You said, I'll give you this non-compete in exchange for you buying my business. If you didn't want to do it, you can't blame them because it's part of the negotiation. And that's a big part of this. The bargaining position of the two parties here is equal. That's one of the things the court's going to look at here. And they say, look, if you didn't like the non-compete, you shouldn't have negotiated it. Okay? So the question then is simply, if it's part of the sale of a business, a court's going to look at it and go, you negotiated it, you're on the hook for it. You're a sophisticated party in an arm's length transaction, live with it. And so that type of agreement is going to be allowed to be broader than the other kind, and courts are more likely going to enforce it by simply saying, if you didn't like it, why did you negotiate it? Okay? Second, the other one that we're talking about is more common, and that's the one where you're working for a company, and one day they walk in and say, hey, we want you to sign a non-compete, and they hand it to you. Sign it. Now, it's not uncommon that you walk in on day one, and you say, I would like a job here. And they say, oh, you want a job here? We'll hire you. Sign a non-compete. Slightly different positions you're in right there, but doesn't mean that the non-compete's not enforceable. But that is something the court's going to look at, because what happens is when you are asked to sign a non-compete at a business you are working for by your boss or people over you, you actually have a little less bargaining power. It's not an arm's length transaction, and you might feel you have to sign it, otherwise you're going to get fired or treated less. And also, the court's going to say, what did you get out of this? What's the consideration? Now, there are some industries that routinely have non-competes that are enforceable that make complete sense. So the example I'm going to give you is from an industry I worked in, radio. I know radio stations that would hire a morning person and say, if we hire you to work here, we're going to sign you to a 3-year contract. But as part of the contract, you promise that if you leave at the end of the 3 years, you cannot work in this market for 2 more years or 1 more year, this market. And they'll often define the market and they'll define the length of time. And their position is, look, in the 3 years you're here, you're going to be on the radio talking about yourself, building up an audience, but we're going to put up billboards, we're going to do advertising, we're going to do TV commercials. We're going to put you out in the community. We're going to spend 3 years investing in you so that at the end of your 3 years, you're going to be worth more money, not just to us, but to a competitor. So a competitor can come along at 3 years and a day when your contract expires. You can cross town and immediately get in the air, and people will know who you are because we spent 3 years building you up. So a non-compete in a setting like that is usually going to be enforceable as long as the time frame is reasonable and the region is reasonable. So if they had you sign a contract and say you cannot work in America for 10 years as a disc jockey, that's unreasonable. And the radio station couldn't make the argument and say, well, we made you a star in this market in Michigan, therefore you can't go to New Mexico. That wouldn't make any sense. So I've seen the non-competes in the radio industry, and it often say in this market or within 50 miles of this market or within 50 miles of the radio station, or they'll draw something like that. And they'll usually say for a year or 2 years. And it's not uncommon that you will hear about people who are riding out a non-compete because they signed a non-compete, they're going to honor it, and they just simply have to kill the time until they get to the end of the non-compete because they want to stay in that market or whatever. So the argument makes sense, but they can't keep you from working. So in other words, the non-compete is going to have to allow you to make a livelihood. So if you sign a non-compete and it says, and it's vague, let's just say it's vague, you can't work in radio for 10 years. Presumably, you can go to another market and work or someplace else because courts have struck down non-competes that were so broad that they said, look, if we actually enforced this person could never work again, or they couldn't work for so long that they'd starve to death. So they have to allow you to make a living. And so keep in mind, again, the two primary distinctions here are if it's part of the goodwill of a business sale, courts are more likely going to enforce it, particularly as long as it's somewhat reasonable. Length of time for a particular area, okay? And the broader the business, by the way, the broader the area is going to be. Suppose that you had a business that serviced a 5-state area. Court's going to uphold it if they say you can't compete in those 5 states, even though it's a huge area, because that's where you were, that's where your name is known, okay? So geographically and length of time. When it comes to the fact that someone walked up to you and handed you a non-compete, if it was a non-compete you're given at hire, a court's more likely going to enforce it by saying if you didn't want the job, you could have just not taken the job. But the bigger problem is that if you're working someplace, you're already there, and they walk in and they hand you a non-compete and say, here, sign this. Some courts are going to look at that and say, what did you get out of signing that? What did you gain from that? What consideration did you gain? And in contract law, generally speaking, the parties exchange promises, but they also exchange consideration. And the most obvious contract like that I can describe to you is I buy a car from you. I hand you cash, you hand me the car, figuratively speaking. So an exchange of consideration. So if I sign a non-compete with you, what did I get out of it? And that's going to be a problem. So that's one slight thing that will help you if someone asks you to sign a non-compete where you're already employed. But the court could look at it and say you were in an at-will state, meaning they could fire you at will for any reason, so long as it's not one of the wrong reasons. And theoretically, if you refuse to sign it, they could let you go. But on the other hand, they're allowed to let you go. So that might be an issue. So remember that the two distinctions with whether you're selling a business or whether you're an employee. And then the other question is how reasonable is it with respect to its duration and with respect to its region where it's enforced. But keep in mind a couple things about non-compete agreements. And if you've already signed one, this one won't help you. But keep in the back of your mind that if you're ever asked to sign one, don't sign it right away. Ask if you can look at it later and call around. And an attorney could go through it very, very quickly and let you know. But you can also do research on this and probably figure a lot of this out. But what you're going to want to look at is how reasonable it is. And you might be able to negotiate parts of it, for instance. But you never know. But one of the other things that you'll often see pop up in a non-compete is where someone goes to sell a business and the owner of the business signs a non-compete and then tries to bind all of his employees to a non-compete. But the problem is that if you are simply working at a business and you hear they're about to get sold, okay, you might go, gee, I wonder if I still have a job or not, okay? But if you then get told, oh, by the way, we signed a non-compete and it's going to bind you, You go, what's this we business? Did I sign a non-compete? So you're going to want to find out whether or not someone's trying to rope you into a non-compete. But also keep in mind, if you were to go to buy a business and you buy a business and there's a sole proprietor who signs a non-compete and he's got a bunch of salespeople working for him, you might need to get non-competes from each of them yourself if you want this to work. And you might then have to work with the seller and say, look, I'll buy the business. I need a non-compete from you and from these people here. And that might take some extra negotiation because those people might go, why? We're out of business in 3 minutes anyways. We may have to go work for a competitor. But also, if you are in a situation with a non-compete, especially if you're the one who's buying a business and you want to put in a non-compete clause, you're going to want to put in a choice of law. It's not uncommon that somebody from another state buys a business in this state. And the law in this state says one thing and the law in this state says another. And at that point, it becomes a nightmare. And so if someone brings to you a non-compete, says, hey, I need you to sign this non-compete, read it and see what the choice of law says. Because they might have put a thing in there that says, yeah, by the way, any thing here is going to be decided by a court in New Jersey under New Jersey law. And you're in Michigan going, New Jersey? And then finally, just a little afterthought here because it's popped into my head. But if you are buying a business and you get someone to sign the non-compete, you're going to want to make sure that the non-compete agreement is assignable. Meaning that, let's suppose 3 years later, you get sick of the business, you want to sell it, someone comes along and they want to buy it. And you sell the business to this person. Well, the non-compete agreement might not be assignable with that sale. Might not be. And if it's not, this person here, when they go into business and discover this person over here just started competing with them, they might come back after you. And you don't like this finger point, especially when I do it. So there you go. So non-compete agreements generally are enforceable. The primary considerations are, first, is it a business sale or simply an employer coming to an employee and asking for it? And then, in both settings, still important, what's the length of time and what's the region of it? But keep in mind that generally speaking, most states allow them, and in most states they are enforceable as long as they are reasonable. Questions, comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. Your computer has crashed. I am the blue screen of death. No one hears your screams.